What's up guys, it's me Jeremy, and today I want to wrap up my Pro Team Comps series by giving you guys the tools to create powerful team comps for yourself. This should hopefully be an amazing guide for anyone starting up a team, and although it may be a little bit difficult to apply to solo queue, it's still possible with a little bit of communication. Just before I start, I want to announce the updates to my streaming schedule. So now that I've got my lag fixed, I can start streaming once again, and I'll definitely do my best to consistently work with this schedule. So I'll now stream on every Friday starting at 4 p.m. PST, and Saturday at 9 a.m. PST, and then lastly Sunday at 10 a.m. PST. That is what this schedule will look like from now on. Anyways, let's get started. Now, every team composition will have some weaknesses and some strengths, so it's your job to make sure that you can empower the weaknesses while also avoid the strengths. Let's start off with the mechanics of a team composition. Now, the basic mechanics of a team are as follows. First, we have the early game. This is of course going to be how strong your team can perform in the early game overall, from the level 1 fight to the laning matchups to your ganking ability. A team composition that excels in this focuses on winning the laning phase and snowballing into an insignificant teamfight phase since you're already so far ahead. An example of a team that excels in this would be Gambit Gaming's ideal composition, where they simply pick comfort champs that they're extremely good on, and then they do their best to win the laning phase. Champions that do well in this are those that are powerful in lane, or have the ability to gank lanes very easily. Next, we have the teamfight power. This consists of how well your team can perform in a teamfight, ranging from the initiation ability and the kiting potential. A team comp that excels in this focuses on being able to execute teamfights extremely well. An example of a team that excels in this would be the hard engage composition. That comp is able to initiate very easily and then follow up that initiation with some awesome damage. Champions that do well in this area are those that are powerful in teamfights. After that comes the pushing ability. This ranges from simple wave clear to sieging or even split pushing. A composition that excels in this category is able to push easily, as well as either stall for sieges or stall for a split push. And they also excel very well in being able to disengage fights, since a lot of their tactics are based on stall. An example of a composition that excels in this would be the poke composition, which focuses on using poke to force enemies off of objectives and then take them for free. Champions that do great in this area have either high ranged abilities, are a powerful duelist for split pushing, or are great at disengaging and avoiding fights. And then the last mechanic that we have is the late game. A composition that excels in this often revolves around the power of your AD carry, and is able to scale extremely well into the late game, as the champions have some sort of scaling mechanic like Nasus, or they simply just scale well with items. An example of a composition that excels in this category would be the kite composition, as that focuses on protecting the massive strength of the late game AD carry. Champions that do well in this area scale tremendously well into the late game, or can kite really well for their carries on their team. Now, most team compositions will not focus so heavily on a single area, as that can leave you open to a lot of weaknesses. A big example being that most compositions that focus only on pushing are pretty terrible at team fighting. Rather, what you want to do is choose a mechanic that your players are very good at, and then use your champion picks to play to that composition's strengths while also covering up the weaknesses. To remain consistent, let's use the poke comp as a continued example. You might think to pick someone like Blitzcrank as a support champion in this composition, due to his incredible ability to pull opponents in range for an easy pick that will aid your sieging ability due to the high pressure that Blitzcrank's grab brings. But if we fill up the rest of the team with picks like Jace top, Lux mid, Caitlyn AD carry, and Cho'Gath jungle, where every single pick is focused on the strength of our composition, that actually leaves us extremely vulnerable, since our weaknesses are suddenly so large. That team comp would be ridiculously vulnerable to hard initiations and flanking, and could be easily, completely countered by champions such as Zac or Malphite. Rather, instead of Blitzcrank, we would pick a support like Janna or Zyra to provide disengage, thus plugging a major hole in one of our weaknesses. And this is the key to making team compositions. You need to focus on a strength, but at the same time, be aware of the weaknesses that you've left open and plug those up. That poke composition with Janna or Zyra in it is very strong due to the ability to disengage fights and kite out engages to where you can actually teamfight at a pretty solid rate. In general, you want to focus on having a composition that is very powerful in one area and only leaves a slight weakness open in at most one area as well. In this case, the poke composition is incredibly strong at pushing and sieging, but may lack some early game strength due to the disengage and poke nature of the champions, creating somewhat passive lanes. And then it would perform at a fairly average rate in the remaining two categories. This way of making compositions works so well, as it gives your team a general strategy to focus on during the game, while also having two other strategies that you can improvise on depending on the situation, and then it leaves you with only one strategy that you have to avoid. A team that focuses on two strengths will not be strong enough in both of those categories to be able to execute them, or most likely they'll leave open more than one weakness. For example, a team with an incredibly strong early game and an incredibly strong teamfight phase will likely be very vulnerable to split pushing and the late game power of their opponents. Rather than focus on multiple strengths, you would want to focus on just one strength and then have the remainder of your focus go towards avoiding weaknesses in the team. And by doing that, we're left with one strategy your team is amazing at, and two that your team is okay at, and then one that your team needs to avoid. Having to only avoid one strategy in a game significantly reduces counterplay ability, because you can deny opportunities for your opponent to capitalize on weaknesses through smart play, allowing your composition to overall be much stronger. So playing to the strengths of your composition is fairly simple. Just do what your composition was designed to do and focus on the mechanics that your team is best at. But avoiding the weaknesses is much harder and requires a solid understanding of mechanics. In general, what you need to do to avoid the weaknesses of your composition is first you want to fully understand the mechanics of your weakness, and then what you need to do is also fully understand the counter mechanic to those respective weaknesses. And then focusing on being able to do that and being ready for your opponents to capitalize on that weakness should in turn allow you to avoid your weaknesses entirely. For example, if your composition's weakness is the early game, you would want to avoid early teamfights by playing passive in lane. This may cause you to lose some minor advantages, but it will in turn prevent your team from actually falling a significant amount behind. Your goal during the early game would be not to win, but rather to go even as you transition into the strengths of your team later on in the game. If your composition's weakness is teamfights, you would want to avoid teamfights through the use of strong disengage that is difficult to outplay, thus preventing fights from happening in the first place. By anticipating teamfights, you can avoid them through your disengage ability entirely and simply just not let them happen, and instead focus on the strengths of your team. If your composition's weakness is pushing, what you might want to do is avoid sieges entirely by focusing on ganking your opponents. If they go to split push, gank them and then group as a team and capitalize on the mismatched numbers that you currently have for the short period of time. Or if they go to siege down your towers, flank them and set up an easy team fight or something like that, whatever the strengths of your composition are. And lastly, if your team composition's weakness is the late game, make sure to play very aggressive in the early game and do your best to capitalize on early advantages and snowball into a victory based on whatever the strengths of your composition are. Anyways, in general, do your best to construct a composition based on one strength and plug the holes to where you have only one weakness that you can avoid. Be sure to play to your strengths and do your best to avoid the weaknesses. My name is Jeremy, and that is it for my video on how to make a strong team composition. Please follow my stream at twitch.tv/Jeremy_GamingCurios for more updates on whenever I'm streaming. And I'd love it if you could support me with a like. Please subscribe for more awesome content in the future if you enjoyed this video. And I'd love if you could follow me on Facebook at facebook.com/GamingCurios. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.